Our 4-year-old Ben is in a preschool called Happy Hours. I think what their intention was in naming the school was that we would think of these hours our children were at school as their happiest hours. But I've heard several parents admit that they are their own happiest hours. And then I can't help but chuckle when I Google it for like the phone number or something, and what pops up first is Chili's and drink specials. A few months ago, we had our first parent-teacher conference. And it's funny. In fact, if I'm totally honest, I know it's a little crazy how nervous I was about that conversation. So I thought I'd ask you, what are some of the thoughts that go through a parent's mind before a parent-teacher conference? This is the interactive part. Yeah, Julie. Not much talking? How much talking did she do? Okay, anything else? What are you nervous about? Yeah. Will there be any surprises? Interesting. What else? How well are they listening? Interesting. Yeah. How are they treating others? Yeah. Are they fitting in? Yeah. Might be a more interesting question if I ask the students here, what are you worried about your teacher sharing with your parents? Anyway, I think we can all admit we have a lot invested in those conversations. And if you're like me, you might be able to admit that there's a little crazy involved. You know, I was nervous. I knew, we all know our kids a little different, but how different? And is it time to call in a professional? Those are some of my questions. And if I'm really honest, I put a lot of energy into those sorts of questions. I wonder if you've been there. We care so much for our children. We want them to be amazing in some way. If they're not amazing academically, then maybe they can be amazing at sports. Or if not that, then maybe it's music, or maybe it's theater. We know they're amazing to us. We just want the world to know it too. And if we don't have children, maybe we can be honest enough to recognize that in our own selves. We want others to know, hey, I'm not so bad. We want to hear from others, you're going to be great. You are great. You are on the right track. Something very special is happening within you. And for those of us that are parents, we want that success not just for ourselves, but for our children as well. But what if we have it wrong? We want our son or daughter to make the varsity team. We want them to make it into the AP class, into the advanced math group. We want them to get into the best college possible. We want them to be happy and successful. What if the best is the wrong request? What if pushing for the highest level of a class or a team is actually the thing that keeps our child from knowing Jesus in a way that would save their life when they're really down? By the time the tween years roll around, life can be getting complicated. For many, it can be their relationship with God that pulls them through the dark night. God can be a powerful ally, but if we've chosen earthly success for ourselves or for our children, if we've chosen busyness as a coping mechanism, I wonder if we've deprived them and ourselves of something even more important. What happens when what we think is best is actually the wrong request? What happens when good intentions fall short? Thankfully, parents advocating for the wrong things isn't anything new. Thankfully, people advocating for slightly a good thing but not the best thing has been creatures called humans on the earth. We're going to spend our time looking at such a story in the Gospel of Matthew in chapter 20, but let me start with what's happening. In the arc of Jesus' story, we're starting into the rising action. So far in the story, Jesus has been preaching and teaching and healing people and frustrating the powers that be. And now he starts talking about his death and resurrection and foreshadowing what's going to happen in later chapters. In verse 17, this is how it starts. While Jesus was going up to Jerusalem, he took the 12 disciples aside by themselves and said to them on the way, "See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and scribes, and they will condemn him to death. Then they will hand him over to the Gentiles to be mocked and flogged and crucified, and on the third day he will be raised." The chapter after this morning's text, which we don't have projected for you, is the one where Jesus rides into Jerusalem on a donkey, and people lay down their palm branches, and they proclaim Jesus' coming kingdom. People are starting to get the message that Jesus has laid claim to the messianic crown, that he's going to establish a kingdom and be king of it. And at the same time, Jesus is saying things that contradict that message. He's talking about his coming death. They're a little confused. But people are getting excited about the kingdom talk. They're basically ignoring the weird death stuff. It's funny that it's nothing new that people are ignoring the stuff Jesus said that they didn't want to hear. Can I get a head nod? So they're wondering about their own place in his kingdom. Who's going to get what job? What's the flow chart going to look like? Where am I going to fall in it? The disciples, if you remember, they invested everything. They left their lives to follow Jesus for more than 2 years, and they thought that the payout was coming. Like a company going public, they were about to reap their reward. The sacrifice would be worth it. So in the midst of this, we meet James and John's mom. We know from other Bible passages that her name was Salome. I'm going to call her Sally because I can't say that very well. Starting in Matthew chapter 20, verse 20, this is what happens. Then the mother of the sons of Zebedee, so James and John, came to him with her sons, came to Jesus with her sons. So, Jesus had just pulled the disciples away, so she must have sort of kind of been not too far away and stepped in there, brought James and John around her, and they all go to Jesus. And then she kneels before him, and she asks a favor of him. And Jesus said to her, "What do you want?" And she said to him, "Declare that these 2 sons of mine will sit one at your right hand and one at your left in your kingdom." So what's going on here? Sally, the mother of James and John, comes to Jesus with a favor to ask. And we know that Sally is a good mom. She's actually someone who really respects Jesus. We know she knelt as a sign of reverence for Jesus. We know later that after Jesus' resurrection, she's among the other women who discover that the tomb is empty, and she goes looking for his body to anoint him, and he's not there. We know that Sally had good intentions, really good intentions. She wanted her sons to be next to Jesus. But it's hard to know, based on this story, whether Sally is being a helicopter mom or whether her sons put her up to it. But the request is clear. In this new thing you're doing, Jesus, make my kids your deputies. I want them to be the vice presidents. Give them the highest rank you can in your kingdom, Jesus. Please let my kids be great. And Jesus replies in verse 22, but he doesn't reply to Sally. He turns to her boys. Maybe he's saying, I know you put your mom up to this. Or I know you squawked about wanting to be in these positions so much that your mom's heart got in it and then she wanted to go for it for you. Can I get a head nod? And Jesus turned to these boys, James and John, young men. I guess boys are not a good thing to say. He says, you do not know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I am about to drink? And undeterred by Jesus' cryptic response, they immediately reply, we are able. Very quickly, as though Jesus is talking about a microbrew or espresso. But Jesus was talking about his coming mocking. These were the verses we read first. His flogging that was coming, his crucifixion that he had just told them about. In fact, the cup that Jesus drank was a cup of vinegar that was offered to him on the cross. It was a cup of suffering. Have you ever gotten in over your head because you didn't want to say no to something good? Especially if it was a kid, one of your kids asking for it, or someone you love. Have you ever experienced what happens when what you thought was best was the wrong request? And Jesus goes on, he says to James and John, he said to them, you will indeed drink my cup. This is in verse 23. But to sit at my right hand and at my left, this is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared by my Father. Jesus promises they will get the cup of suffering. And indeed, James becomes the first disciple who's martyred. John dies later of old age with a life that wasn't easy. So it backfired a bit. The truth is, this is kind of what I wanted to get to. Our attempts at success and power or advocating for our children's own position in this world can backfire. We might be teaching our children to advocate for the wrong things. We ourselves might be seeking something that will backfire at us in the long run. Jesus teaches what you might call an upside-down power principle. In verse 24, it says, when the 10 heard it, they were angry at the two brothers. And then in verse 25, it says, but Jesus called to them and said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them. So James and John were basically oppressed by the Gentiles, and their great ones are tyrants over them. It will not be so among you, but whoever wishes to be great among you must be your servant. And whoever wishes to be first among you must be your slave, just as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Now back to verse 24, this I find so fascinating. So when the other 10 disciples heard that James and John were trying to get these positions of honor, they got pissed. What it made me think about was, remember if you're in high school now or when you were in high school and a friend that went to a teacher who never allowed them to have extra credit, but your friend went and they asked the teacher if they could do extra credit, and the teacher uncharacteristically said yes, but you didn't find out about that until after grades were posted. So you could have done the extra credit too, but you didn't ask. That's what this makes me think of. It's like, well, they asked. Why didn't I ask? Or say you're at work and a coworker kind of finds the guts to ask for the promotion that you want, and they got it, probably just because they asked. Imagine how frustrating that gets. I feel like that's sort of what's happening with the disciples. They just get mad because they wanted the same thing. Sometimes what's best winds up being the wrong request. This goes to show that none of the disciples really got it. They didn't quite understand what Jesus was trying to teach them all along. They wanted to be on top. They wanted to get there first. But the kingdom doesn't work like that. So you might be asking, so what you're saying, Pastor Karen, is that wanting my children to have the good life is against what Jesus was teaching. And I'm going to say, yeah, sometimes. When the good life means putting comfort and power and prestige over knowing Jesus, I'm going to say, yeah. When the good life means putting worldly success over developing a relationship with God, yeah. When we say the good life, it doesn't prioritize God's kingdom or being an active part of Christ's church, yeah. Sometimes what we think is the best is not the right request. The same applies to adults and students, what we're seeking. Sometimes what we think is best for us or best for our family is actually not the best request. So how do we become what Jesus is talking about, this idea of being a servant and giving your life for others? Well, it's not easy. It's not just about impressing God with all of our service opportunities, although serving is a way to cultivate a Jesus heart within us. It's not about just serving the homeless. It's about how we act in our homes. You see how this is so tricky? I want to share a story with you about a family that I really admire. They're one of our own families, and I admire the way that they desire to get their kids connected to Jesus and to this community in a way that when the success falls out, or they don't get the part in the play, or they don't get into the college they were hoping for, or when they've got a sucky job right out of school, they're going to have Jesus to lean on in a real way. I'm not sharing this with you because this is the only way to handle things, but I'm hoping this message just makes you have conversations with people. To talk about this idea of when the best intention is not the best, really. So this is a family that attends very faithfully, and they been very careful to not to over-program their children. They have two. And then when their son was going into, or maybe he was in kindergarten, he hadn't started sports yet, and he really wanted to play baseball. And baseball happened to be Sunday morning. T-ball. Is it T-ball in kindergarten? T-ball. And I remember the mom just wrestling with this. He hasn't done sports yet. I want him to have that experience. It's such an important experience for a young child to be part of a team, to be able to discover if this is something they want to do. Because, eventually I want him to have something he loves doing, because that's part of what it means to develop as a person, to develop yourself. But she weighed what she felt like the value was of being in church on a regular basis. She thought about the Sunday school lessons that she's been teaching, because she's a teacher for our Sunday school. She thought about how important it was that he learn about Jesus. And she thought about all of you and how much value she believes you add to her son's young life. And so she asked him, she said, "Buddy, what do we do on Sunday mornings?" And he said, "Church." And she said, "What do you think we should do about this?" And he said, "Church is important." And she said, "Yeah, it is." And she said, "It's not always going to be on Sunday." And he said, "I hope not." And she said, "Can we wait a year and see?" He said, "Yeah." And I can tell you now, he's doing baseball. And they didn't have to miss church for a year or 2 or 3. And he is growing into a very cool young man, and he values you guys. Some of you know his name. Some of you talk to him when you see him. Some of you know his mom. That's a family that has really wrestled with this idea about the best thing. We're coming into this time in our culture where it's getting harder to believe in God. I don't know if you've known that or noticed that, but I just read some new scholarship about that, and it's really concerning. And as hard as it is for you to believe in God some days, it's going to be a lot harder for our kids to believe. A lot harder. So we're finding ourselves sort of at this place where if we do believe, we're going to have to live like we do. We're going to have to live like we do hard. We're going to have to show our students, our children, and our neighbors even, and our grandchildren and our nieces and nephews, how we are making the choices that we're making. Now, Jesus talked about giving your life away in this passage, that's the true path to success. I could tell you that giving your life away means giving up your wealth and giving up your power and giving up your prestige. And the parents out there, you're saying, check, check, check. I have given those things up. Moms, it's Mother's Day. Maybe you especially. Check, check, check. Gave up the career a while ago. My kids are older, haven't gotten back into it. Dad, some of you haven't taken the promotion because it would take too much time away. You're saying, I have given these things up. I have served my family. Now, what Salome did, she was serving her children. But what Jesus did, Jesus was serving God. That's the goal. Not that we would serve our children or our families so that they would be successful or even happy, but that we would serve our families and our children and our neighbors and our loved ones and the people we don't even know, so that they would know Jesus well enough so that in their dark hour, they know who to call on. We serve our families so that they might know Christ. That's the goal. That's keeping the main thing the main thing. That's the request. That's the thing to aim at. And do I know how that works out for your family on a Sunday? Of course I don't. And I am not quite there yet, so I really am reticent to cast judgment. But I want you to be there for me when I have to make that decision. And I want you to be there and say, you know what, Karen, we really wrestled with this, and we felt like our kid was knowing Jesus here, and so we made this decision, and we kept going for Jesus ourselves, and we kept sharing that with our kid so that it was no question in our kid's mind that when we struggled, we went to Jesus, so that what they learned, that when they struggled, they could go to Jesus too. This is what a church does. This is what a community of Jesus followers do together. We help each other. We can help each other make these decisions. We can help each other. We can't do this as individuals. This takes a certain amount of vulnerability. It takes a certain amount of friendship.